Moving forward to our next session, the speaker for this session is both a yogi and entrepreneur. He's the founder and CEO of White Hat JR, an edtech startup that was bought by Byju's for $300 million in August 2020. He was also the CEO of Discovery Networks in South Asia, senior marketing director at Kraft Foods Group, consultant at BCG, and brand manager at P&G, to name a few of his diverse echelons. He's the best selling novelist and striving yogi, now based in Mumbai. He's the author of Johnny Gone Down, whose film rights are acquired by Ronnie Screwvala Productions. His other fiction books include Keep Off the Grass and The Seeker. It gives me immense pleasure to have Mr. Karan Bajaj, an alumnus of IMB 2002 batch, to Anusmaran 2020. This session will be moderated by Rahul Singh, a banker by the day and writer by the night. He serves as the principal corporate advisory group IIM Udaipur and is the author of book 25 Journeys to Ikigai, slated to release in 2020. Over to you, Rahul.
Thank you so much, Sneha. So I think Karan will be joining us in a few moments. Before that, as you are probably aware, that Karan is one of our alumnus, and he's 2002 batch. And recently, in fact, last month, he sold his startup to Byju for all cash deal, 300 million. So congratulations to you, Karan. Maybe we could have a round of applause for one of our alumni, and we could just celebrate that.
I think I found a business opportunity for Zoom or somebody, how to do online applauses and all, you know.
That would be wonderful if we could find a way to applause people online. I'm just waiting for Karan to come in any moment. And we do have Pigeonhole, so you can post your questions in Pigeonhole. We have posted the link to Pigeonhole both on WhatsApp as well as on the live chat. So please do make use of this opportunity, post your question on Pigeonhole, and not just post, also give them a thumbs up, give them a like, so that we know that which questions are popular, which questions are trending. And we will try to take that in the live session.
Rahul, I think Karan's on.
Hi, Karan. Welcome to Anusmaran 2020 Singapore version.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. We have been very eager to have you. And you would, if I could just show you the WhatsApp messages that have been pinging on my phone and on the group chat for having you, and the amount of questions we have for you. So thank you so much for making time for us. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a delight. Thank you.
So I will straight away go into the elephant in the room. So you are a yogi, and the latest news about you is that you also made 300 million. I'm not sure how much of that you made, but your company made 300 million. So the question that we have for you is something which I personally relate to. When I was in college, there used to be a very popular book, The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. And if I look at your story, it's, I think, somewhat in a reverse way. So you were a yogi, and then not only you started a startup, but you also managed to sell it for quite a substantial amount of sum. I will take some time to count number of zeros in 300 million. And now probably you have enough money to buy a Ferrari, and not just buy, maybe give one to me as well. So my question to you is, how has this journey turned out, where you started as a yogi and are an entrepreneur and now are sitting on a massive pile of cash? Can you walk us through that journey?
Journey of sorry, I'm just trying to understand the journey of the whole journey, the journey of making the money. Sorry, what's the
maybe briefly your journey from the point when in 1996 you were a student at BIT Misra, or even before that, your upbringing as an army kid.
Sure.
And until now, how has that planned out?
Sure, I'll do that. Okay, so I first thank you for having me. Let me start by that. I was in IIM from 2000 to 2002. I don't know if any of my batchmates are on the call, but I had a really wonderful time there, and at IIM Bangalore, and I actually wrote a novel about it also. I wasn't the most positive influence of the class, but I really did have a good time. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I would say, rather than go through the whole kind of journey of timeline of events, I would say there were 2 or 3 very, I would say, seismic events overall in my life, which I think would have some relevance. The first one was that in 2008, right, I left my job at Procter & Gamble. So till then, it was a reasonably conventional existence, right? Like I was with BIT, went to IIM Bangalore, did reasonably well there, got into Procter & Gamble. And then I was kind of going down the regular kind of path, if you will. But I was about 28, 29. I was getting a little bit restless that I left my job at IIM, at P&G. And for about almost 6 to 9 months, I just traveled, right? So I was traveling to, I was in South America for a while. I traveled to Brazil, Portugal, etc. Brazil, Peru, Argentina, etc. Then I traveled in Eastern Europe for a few months. And I was just like, I always wanted to travel. So I did that. And then when I came back from that, I lived the worst case of what you would have expected from a leap, right? So I came back at the thick of the US recession, right? Lehman Brothers had collapsed then, and there were no jobs. And I was actually kind of pretty much broke because I'd saved some money, obviously, which I had all spent in the year in traveling. And then I came back with the expectation that I would find a job easily, but it was a very, very bad recession. And I was kind of sleeping on my sister's couch in the US, right? And I'd pretty much hit rock bottom in the way life could have expected to be, because I was almost 30 years old. Like I had no job. I was like pretty much, so everything that you can imagine in the when you take a risk, right? The worst case happened to me. And quite honestly, 2 months later, I found a job with BCG, and then I kind of resurrected my career, right? And I think that was good in a way, because I kind of lived the worst case scenario. That after that, I was always a little bit like, my mind was that, look, I mean, things work out, right? I mean, if you choose, things eventually will work out, right? I'll always have an opportunity to basically kind of rebuild myself, right? Given the education that we all have had. So I think that was quite shaping, because after that I got very comfortable with, I would say, I think people are talking about these sabbaticals, but actually I think of them as very extraordinary growth events, if you will, right? So I would actually, when I felt that my career was hitting a bit of a stability, I would then pursue something which I was deeply interested in, without too much fear about where that would lead me, right? So in 2012, I was with Craft. I left for a year and did yoga for a year, and I was in an ashram. It was very tough, right? Because for one whole year, like from 5 o'clock in the morning till midnight, you would just keep doing like, yoga, anatomy, theory on yoga, like lived in an ashram with a lot of discipline. When I came back from that, I realized that actually I did very well in my job, and I kind of accelerated again, right? So I started to have this, as long as you are choosing extraordinary growth, no matter what vector you'll choose it in a way, your personality shapes so much that you get rewarded for it in kind of the regular fields of life as well, right? So after that, I got very comfortable with that. So if you look at my career, it's a series of like I would say, some would say of them as unfinished journeys. For me, I was just doing things that I was very, very deeply interested in. So when I left Discovery to start a startup, by that time I was so used to this idea that that like when you jump into things which are very, very high growth endeavors, eventually things will work out, right? So I didn't know whether the startup would work or not. Like some of my things have worked, some of them have not worked. And I didn't know whether the startup would work or not, but I had this feeling that, look, if I come back after 2 years of knowing tech inside out well, if I was the CEO of Discovery who went to start a startup and really understood tech inside out, I was very confident that once I come back to the real world and find a job again, it'll work out, right? Because people would value the fact that I was a CEO who also now knows tech inside out, right? So I feel like the liberation moments in my life have been taking the first big leap, hitting rock bottom after the first leap, and realizing that there is always a way to claw out of the rock bottom. I think that was, I would say, one formative event. The second formative event was taking a year off to live in an ashram and coming back and realizing that I accelerated my corporate journey, right? Because I realized that was a cataclysmic kind of point in my life where I felt that, look, as long as I'm choosing these very high growth endeavors, I'll shape my personality so much that once I come back to a regular job, I'll be doing even better at it. And that thesis kind of proved itself out after I did my yoga, then took another year to write and stuff like that, right? So that's what I would say is the the journey, if you will.
Yeah, that's a very interesting journey, I would say, and we'll dig a bit deeper into it. But you mentioned something interesting. You said that you were not sure if things would work out, and some things have worked out, some things have not worked out. Now, generally, when somebody is as successful as you, things which have worked out get amplified. But
Correct.
there are obviously things which have not worked out. Would you want to highlight a couple of those?
Yeah, sure. I think very much so. And I've written about those on my blogs as well. I actually think the see what I've kind of concluded right now about life in a simple sentence is that I kind of think of life like a bit of a slot machine, right? I feel like I think that all you kind of owe life is your gift of energy, right? You come in every day, you play the slots, right? Sometimes you hit a jackpot, sometimes you go broke, and you don't know what the input that you put into all of these is the same, right? So if I look at it, right, my first novel, Keep Off the Grass, was written in about 2 to 3 months only, right? It did very well in India at that time, right? Got a movie deal, did very well at that point, right? If I look at my third novel, The Seeker, I took 5 years, out of which I wrote almost full time for 2 years out of those, right? 3 years I was writing part time, 2 years I wrote full time. And it was like a cataclysmic failure, right? Penguin Random House published it. And they basically had to kind of what they call in publishing remainder of the copies, right? Which is basically sell them off to at heavy discounts in bookstores and then basically keep them in the warehouse, right? It was a disaster, despite the fact that I spent 5 years writing that one and only 3 months writing the first one. If I look at my Discovery stint when I was the CEO of Discovery, I did a lot to try to really kind of shake up a very dormant kind of television network in India. I would say most of what I did didn't work, right? I was actually probably kind of the worst CEO of Discovery in India because I tried to do a lot and could not make it work. I put the same energy into a startup and suddenly, that worked, right? So I've seen that almost my input and my energy has nothing to do with the output. So what I've concluded about life is that, look, I just need to play the slot machine every day, approach it with full energy. And then sometimes I'll hit a jackpot, sometimes I won't. And then I can't really complain. I like be a yogi in the sense that don't be too happy if you hit the jackpot, don't be too sad if you miss it. It's just it's a nature of big creative bets that by their nature, they're very hard to make work, right? And that's just my destiny is to keep taking those bets. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a lovely point to bring, that output often is independent of the input. You put the same input and X number of other things go into making sure whatever output comes out of it comes out of it.
Yeah,
only one of the various factors that goes there. But you did also talk very passionately about your book writing, including that book which you took 5 years to write. Right. And I have not read your books, but I have read the synopsis, and this is what I gather, that they somehow seem to be a bit biographical in nature.
Right.
And maybe it's, that's what I feel, maybe it's not correct, maybe it's correct. But the question to you is, which one of this is actually Karan? Is it Samrat, who's a 25-year Yale graduate, goes to Himalayas to find his roots? Or is it the MIT grad Johnny, who is a monk and a software mogul, which you happen to be now, in some sense, you are a startup mogul? Or is it the Harvard economist who is going to Himalayas and seeking himself? Which one of this is the true Karan?
I mean, so I obviously have written very personal novels, right? So I think in a way, they continue to have an audience because they were very personal to me, right? So I wrote about things that I was struggling with, trying to make sense of, right? So as a result of that, I think people keep reading them because there's no attempt at like hiding anything, right? So I would say different phases of life, right? The first novel, I was a traveler, restless, trying to find the meaning, if you will. So I think the first set of the first novel was very traveler oriented, right? I would say the closest I would say is Johnny Gone Down, the second novel, which Ronnie is making into a movie now. I think I'm looking forward to seeing the film come to shape. But in some form, I think I remember being 31 years old and having no job, no money, no wife, right? No house, and and I remember that I couldn't believe this had happened to me, right? So it's because I was reasonably doing quite well before that, and then I just made all these choices, right? I was traveling for a year, came back, all of this stuff, right? And I think Johnny I wrote about was very personal to me because it was like about a guy like me, right, who's trying to make what he thinks are the right decisions for himself, but they don't seem to work out, right? And he keeps doing that over a period of time, right? And in some sense, I think I realized then at age 30, 31 that look, I can't really live a relative life, right? So because at that time I was still in the mindset that people used to be, right? Because that was those was the times of Yahoo groups and stuff, right? People would send all these images of like their first kid and buying their first houses. And here I was pretty much adrift, right? I was just kind of backpacking. I was living out of a backpack, and then I realized that look, I'm gonna just have to do it my way, and I just can't kind of like I just can't like measure myself with any conventional parameters at all. So I think in that sense that second novel is very close to me because I think that helped me understand. My novels have helped me understand my own thinking. And after that, I became very liberated to do what I wanted to do, right? So somewhere around then, I realized that, look, I'm just gonna be living life by my own markers, right? And there would be no, my parents wanted me to get married, etc. But I got married very late at about 35. After at 35, I left everything to live in an ashram. Then I left everything again to do a startup. I got very comfortable around my early 30s that, look, I'm just gonna have to do it my way. And
Sure.
and my definition of success has to be completely my own, right? And it is about living a very creative, experimentative life. So I think Johnny is about a little bit about that. So it's very close to me. Yeah.
So the Johnny is the book that people should read to
Right,
understand
to
the
have it
real
very
current, probably.
correct. I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah. So you talked about decision making, you talked about markers, and these are some of the same language which is spoken in IIM Bangalore campuses,
Right.
or IIM Bangalore campus, or I said campuses because we have a new campus coming up.
Yeah.
What is it that you learned at IIM that you think you applied in your life? Is there anything at all?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in a way the journey kind of started there a little bit itself, right? I was surrounded by people who were so ambitious and intelligent, right? And I remember there was one term, maybe the second term, where I was like that. Look, I'm gonna try to be among the best of these, right? And I really studied very hard and whatever, right? And I probably got like a top 10 rank or something like that. I don't remember right now. But then I think it was very early. I realized that I think 2002 I started to realize that my biggest learning from IIM was that that I'll have to kind of carve my own definition of success, right? Like I won't have to I can be equally competent, but not measure myself by the rank in IIM, the grade point in IIM, the whether I became a CEO at 30 or not. I'll just definitely so I started to realize that look. That everybody high potential people don't all need to follow the same path. Some people's path will be about narrow vertical expertise, and that's wonderful, right? They'll start as finance people and they'll become CFOs and they'll become great bankers. And there'll be some people like me who are just gonna meander, right? Spirit. I'll keep doing multiple things. I won't develop any expertise, and that's okay with me, right? I'm just good at like doing new things, climbing up a new mountain, then abandoning everything and becoming a beginner again and having no sense of identity at all, right? So for example, right now, I mean, everybody's asking me to invest in startups, become a mentor. And I'm saying, look, this is not my destiny at all, right? My destiny is to do, like I've climbed this mountain. I'm going to like soon leave everything and start something from zero again, because that's just what I do well. You know, I'm good at like just becoming nothing again and again, right? Becoming like identityless, having no kind of expertise at all, if you will, right? So that's just my view. So I kind of started to shape that view that look, I could be a narrow vertical expert, right? But that's just not my destiny. I can't compete with this, so I just do my own thing. Yeah, so that's it.
So although you mentioned that your efforts and results may not commensurate, and you talked about destiny, so do you know where you're destined next? Have you thought about it? Is there
yeah, a little bit. I think, as I said, for the next couple of years, obviously the startup journey was cut in the middle a little bit, right? So I'm still in the middle of that because I like kind of climbing mountains, if you will, right? Chasing windmills, climbing mountains. So in a way, I like the idea of building a tech startup in my hand, right? As a founder, like really. And I like the idea very much of building a global consumer tech product from India, scaling it. And I'm right in the middle of that journey. So for the next 2 to 3 years, I'm very committed to the Whitehead Junior journey itself. We are scaling all over the world. I think it's very interesting to scale a consumer product across the world from India. And I'm enjoying the challenge of doing that, creating a world-class product. So I think for the next couple of years, I'm quite sorted. After that, I think I'm a bit of a Buddhist by nature. I like to feel that I'm a beginner, right? That I'm not an expert. Like I like the egolessness of being a beginner, right? So I'll probably do something and something else altogether because I don't like the I don't like the label of being a successful startup person or a successful writer. I like to be like a nobody kind of a thing. So I think I'll start something again, something completely unrelated in which my expertise doesn't count.
So,
Yeah.
so let me explore a bit deeper into this nobody, because
Yeah.
that's how you define yourself. But most people have this, they're not able to wrap their head around this, that here is a guy who has 3 million and also calls himself a yogi. So who is a yogi? And especially to you, my question is, if you are a yogi, and you mentioned that you are, you follow that Buddhist philosophy of egolessness.
Yeah.
So are you a karma yogi or a dhyan yogi or a gyan yogi, bhakti yogi? Which one of these is you?
Yeah, so I think these are labels. I mean, so Jnana Yogi, etc. labels, but in a way, I'm kind of living a life of input without any much thought to output, right? Sometimes, and like, so people who knew me during discovery, right, and they who knew me during the startup, right, there has been nothing that's changed. Discovery was somebody else's company. I was kind of the like temporarily holding it as the CEO, and then this was my own company with my own stake, and so in a way, I felt like the yogis. Detachment is from the output, right, and it's just giving their input, like, and basically losing themselves in their input, right? So I think I've lost myself in my input for the last 10 years or so. Since I started writing, I wrote my first novel. I think after that I've been in this act of like just creating things without too much attachment to the output, right? And part of it is life has made me a yogi, right? I've failed miserably at times, succeeded, like, so at a point of time you just have to realize that it's just a gamble, right? It's okay, don't just don't tire yourself with any output whatsoever.
Sure.
Yeah,
So if I understand correctly, yogi is somebody who's putting the input with no regards
Correct.
to what the output may
yeah,
be.
losing themselves in the input without regards to the output, so that almost every activity that you do becomes a deeply spiritual activity in that
Sure,
sense.
sure. So
Yeah.
what is the input that you put then in that case? Because the output is pretty variable. So what is the input that you do control?
So
and
I
you put
think
into it?
what I'm good at, like I get very deep into things for a period of time, right? So that's kind of what I'm very good at, right? So for example, when I'm running the startup, I would have read every book about a tech startup, every book about creating a product, every book about growth hacking, marketing, tech. I'm very like I love like learning things and going extremely deep into the act of learning them and applying them very fast, quickly, executing exceptionally well. So that's what I think is like kind of my path, right? So if after a couple of years I get into like films, for example, I would like the act very much of like breaking down filmmaking, understanding it in detail, trying to create an excellent output, right? So I think that's what I like. My gift to life is energy, right? I give a lot of my energy to whatever I'm doing. As a result of that, yeah. So that's what I like. I think my yogic input to life is just max energy in everything that I do.
So put maximum effort into everything you're doing. That's
Maximum
the
effort into
mantra.
everything, completely effort in which I lose myself completely, right? I just give it fully. So as a result, I'm not very good at doing multiple things. I go very deep into things, right? So when I left my job to yoga, for example, for a year, people couldn't believe it, right? Like my parents, etc. I was 35 again, not married, and I had left my job again to do yoga, but I couldn't help myself, right? I got very into moksha, enlightenment, nirvana, like the meaning. My mom had died very early. She was only early 50s when she died, right? I saw her kind of body wither away with cancer. So I was very deep into the nature of suffering. Why does it happen? Like, what is the meaning of being a human? So for a year, I just wanted to kind of go very deep into that, right? So again, I didn't think whether the job and this and that, etc. I was just like, I want to really go deep into yoga, and I just went very deep into yoga. Yeah.
Sure. So
I
to me,
just
it
like to
seems,
go very deep into things.
so to me,
Yeah.
it seems like you are saying you are very dedicated to what we call abhyasa, and you are totally bairag with the results. So that's pretty much what
Vairagya,
I
yeah.
get.
Dispassion and exercise, yeah. Vairagya and abhyas, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So there are some other questions around that yoga bit, and before that, I would like to ask you. You mentioned you have read every book that was out there on tech, every book that
Yeah.
was out there on startup. Could
Yes.
you share some of the books that have influenced you?
Yeah, so I think the famous ones everybody knows, right? Hard Things About Hard Things and stuff. So nothing new there. But I think the ones that are less talked about are growth hacking. That entire discipline of growth hacking by Sean Ellis, Brian Balfour, etc. They've written some very good books about growth hacking. Very important for a tech founder to know, because the costs that quite destroy a company, apart from product quality being poor, is acquisition costs and your the ability of tech to enable consumer acquisition without spending money. Growth hacking as a science, I would say. And then second is all the product management related books related, like Hooked, for example. Then some of the gamification stuff, they're very helpful. Very helpful for any startup to know how to create a great product and then how to market with smartness. Yeah.
On the other side, any philosophical or spiritual books that have influenced you greatly?
Oh, a lot, yeah, a lot. So I think those are my, like, I would say perennial books, if you will, right? So the Buddha has been a very kind of important figure in my life, right? In some ways, I think, I think his journey is the most impactful journey that I have seen. So, so I read a fair amount of Buddhist biographies and stuff, Dhammapada, etc. And then I would say Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I always have a copy and I take it along and try to read it often. Yeah.
Right. So there's a question on the chat which says that are you still able to integrate your yogic/spiritual practices into your daily life even today? And a follow-up question on that is, does it help you to charge your batteries? I think the way you have defined yoga is slightly different. It's not like silos. There is work and there is yoga. It's like everything that you're doing, put your maximum effort into it, and that itself is yoga. That's probably how you are defining it.
I'm kind of defining it like that, but I do have, like, I meditate morning and night daily. I have been doing it for the last 5 years or so, since 2013, when I kind of left to live in an ashram, right? So since then, for the last 5-7 years, I have the discipline of a daily morning evening meditation practice. I do yoga very often, right? Like a few days a week at least, because I trained to be a yoga teacher, which is very helpful. I can do it on my own. So I think yoga, meditation, and a little bit of reading, spiritual reading, continues to keep you honest, right? Because these concepts are good to talk in theory, but when, like, you're in a startup and money is running out and all of that stuff, you do need to maintain that. So I think I keep in touch with these spiritual practices, and from time to time, like right now, I really want to go and take a month to do advanced yoga teachers training and do a Vipassana 30-day, somewhere between a 10 and 30-day silent retreat again. Those help a lot, right? Because otherwise, these become theoretical after a while.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I would like to probably a bit deeper on Vipassana, which is basically you're totally silent, you're not talking to anybody.
Yeah.
So how is that experience? Could you explain something about Vipassana?
I've done 3 courses. One immediately after IIM, actually, in 2002 in Dharamsala. That was the first 10-day silent retreat I'd done. After that, I took a long gap and then went for a year off in a yoga ashram. I kind of stopped in the middle in Italy. We went from Europe to India by road, my wife and I. So we stopped in Italy and did a Vipassana there. Then when we came to India, we did the Vipassana there. It's 10 days of silence. And I would say very rigorous, intense meditation from 4 o'clock in the morning till about 10 in the night. And quite life-shaping, right? Very, very life-shaping, right? I think each time I did it, something changed. I think in the second one, I remember getting a very clear level of intense clarity on what I would write about, right? And what my writing would be about. And I think that shaped my second novel or something like that. Then I would say the last one I did, I remember this very clearly, that I had this idea that, look, but I'm not a heavy drinker and stuff, but I was still drinking often, or so I had this very clear sense that I won't touch alcohol and non-vegetarian food again. There was no moral obligation around it. Like, I have no moral judgment one way or the other. But I think that decision was very clarifying for me after that.
So
right,
the saying goes
that decision, because I think if the door is open, you fix it.
Yeah. So the saying
so
goes.
Each time I go there is some insight that then shapes my life for a foreseeable time to come.
Yeah. So like people say, the more silent you get, the more you hear. So what I'm hearing from you is that when you were in that Vipassana, you had more clarity about how you shape your life next. You mentioned the example of your book, what that book would be like.
Correct.
So that's a very interesting thing. So you would recommend Vipassana to everybody?
I would recommend Vipassana to everyone. I think in general, the deeper philosophy is a bit of a Stoic philosophy here, which also helps here, right? That a year off that I did in a yoga ashram or Vipassana for 10 days, or even hiking for that matter, right? Like long hikes like Camino de Santiago, which is this 600-mile hike, right? What I've seen again and again with these things are that over a period of time, right, this was what the Stoics used to call willful poverty, right? So they used to use the word willful poverty, where you kind of like deliberately live in poverty so that you realize how little the soul needs to flourish,
Right.
right? So for me, I think that's been a very consistent part of life, right? Hiking, yoga, meditation, etc. Because and that too, hiking for long stretches like the Camino de Santiago, which is like a
Yeah.
month of just walking, or or like yoga ashram, etc. I think the biggest takeaway for me had always been that, look, after spending a year in an ashram, sleeping on a floor, you realize that like you need very little to get by, right? And that's why your choices are refreshing, are completely pure and honest and authentic. I think that's been the biggest upside for me, right, of doing all of these things, has been that if you hike for a month in the Camino de Santiago, you're just walking, right? It's very simplifying. You wake up in the morning, you walk, you sleep in the basement of a church, you walk the next day, you do keep doing it for 30, 40 days, right? At the end of it, you're like, all you need is a backpack, right? And in a way, for me, that's been very simplifying, right? The more I've done these things, the more I've come back to this idea that, look, I'm just going to do like make completely authentic choices, because in the end, you don't need to live by, right? So when I talk to some of my IM friends, right, I think the constructs that they've created on their life around the location they have to be in, the kids going to a certain school, the certain level of lifestyle that they need to sustain in order to give the mortgages for the house or the cars, etc. It's too limiting. It ends up kind of making your choices inauthentic.
Right.
So I think that's been very useful for me.
So you did talk about hiking, you did talk about backpacking, and the message I'm getting is the lighter your weight is, the further you go, the higher you go. That's what you're saying. If you're not tied down by your mortgage.
I mean, higher further is correct. Somewhat relative. Higher further is relative. I think people have reached much higher and further than me with all of the traditions. But if you're a wandering, experimentative soul, then I would say this layer helps you, because you know that that wandering and experimentation is okay, because most cases it won't work out financially, but it'll be very rich for the soul, and I guess that's the only thing that matters really, because physically you don't need much at all.
Yeah, so there is a direct question on that on the chat. It says, can you share
course.
more about your travel experiences during your sabbatical, and how has that influenced your writing and your life? You've touched upon it, but maybe talk a bit more specific about South America, about Eastern Europe.
Sure. So I'll talk. Like, I've traveled a fair amount on the sabbatical. So I'll talk about the second one with my wife, right? Because that I think is because there was a partner involved as well, right? Typically,
in fact, why don't you tell us about how you met your wife? Because that's a follow-up question. But since you brought it up, why don't you tell us about your wife and the journey that you took together?
Sure. Yeah, my wife is not Indian, so she's an American lady, and I kind of met her in New York, right, in a writers' conference or in a writers' group or something like that. So she's a writer as well. Her first book has just come out in India, and so we met in New York, and then I think a year after we met, or a couple of years after we met, we had decided to go on the sabbatical that I was just about to tell you about. So I think the idea was this thought of kind of willful poverty and austerity, right? And so we traveled from Europe to India by road, right? So like a pretty long journey through Iran and Pakistan and stuff. So we went via road to India, right? And the kind of idea was that we would take the cheapest mode of transport everywhere, right? So we won't like take a flight, etc. We'll just try to live in hostels, and very simplifying. Again, as I said, all of these just are basically lightening up your life, right? In the end, you realize again that for a few months, if you're just like with a backpack every day, making decisions spontaneously, I mean, you can just live very fruitfully. And so I think the general kind of philosophy of travel for me has been that like be austere. Like austerity is very, very good, right? Because I think it just simplifies your life again and again, just kind of again and again. It helps you internalize how little you need to be happy, kind of a thing. Yeah.
So, okay. And what about South America? What were some of the lessons from there?
South America, I was very young, right? So 2008, that was the first time I took off after Procter & Gamble. And I just kind of backpacked through Brazil, Peru, Argentina, etc. At that time, 2008, right? They had never seen Indians before, right? They're obviously just backpacking and stuff. And there was some soap opera that was going around in South America based on an Indian telenovela. It was a telenovela based on an Indian Haveli or something like that. So it was very popular then. So I just was surrounded by love, right? So I just stayed longer and longer. I was just liking it so much there. So I lived in Brazil, then moved on to Peru, then lived on to Bolivia, Argentina, etc. So I was just I was kind of young and free, and I did.
I did notice
I
that.
just traveled there for 3-4 months. Yeah.
I did notice that you like this concept of the boundaryless world, and even the choices that you have made as to where you would hike are not the popular ones. You are not hiking in Japan or in Switzerland. You are going to South America. You are going to Eastern Europe. Is that deliberately trying to push yourself out of your comfort zone to choose?
Yeah, a bit.
Where you will have English problem.
Yeah, correct. A bit was that right? I would say like definitely a big part of that was that that I kind of have always liked travel to be right, and as I said. So at that point, I think there were two things that came out of it overall, right? I would say, if I were to summarize, right? The first thing was that this idea of a very boundaryless world, right? This happened very early in my life, which was very well, right? If you look at our startup also, right? Part of the Whitehead Junior success story is that typically an Indian startup follows a cycle of 2 to 3 years in the Indian market. Then it slowly rolls out in the US, a SaaS product, right? Then it suddenly realizes that the US has done so well. Why did we do 2 to 3 years in India at all? The US is such a high GDP market. The startup has done so well. Then they start to scale in the US, and then they are like, okay, now let's scale to Europe if it's accepted in the US. In our case, right, because I had this construct of a very boundaryless world from the beginning, after the first few months of it doing well in India, we said, let's scale in the US, right? It did very well in the US. Then within a couple of months right now, we said, okay, we'll open up Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Germany, UK. So we opened up a bunch of markets. Singapore just 2 days ago, actually. And within a year, what really started to happen was that very high markets, and as a result, we're cash flow positive. That happened because of these very early backpacking experiences where I really genuinely believe that the world is very similar rather than dissimilar, right? Boundaryless, like a person in Brazil is not different. So even now we are we are expanding in Brazil, Indonesia, etc. Very confidently that we'll be able to figure out a local market strategy there, right? Where we'll be able to hire teachers from there, students from there. So we were, so I think that early kind of experience of a very boundaryless world was very helpful that way to shape. Yeah.
I think your army background, your parents, I believe, are in army, and that made you travel throughout India, if not the
Correct.
world. That probably made you that the seeds of that boundaryless world were sowed very early in your life.
I would say so. Yeah, I would say so because the army in an Indian context is very boundaryless and also very diverse in that sense, right? So army officers are from very diverse Tamil, North Indian, South Indian. So you don't have much of the talk that you hear in India in the beginning, right? In North Indian, I was South Indian. I always used to be surprised even in the IM or BIT when people used to talk about all this stuff, right? Because our army world is very homogeneous and diverse. So I think those ideas were very early, but I think my travels definitely helped a lot with that. So as a result, when I did my business stuff, even in the startup, I had no doubt at all that it would work in Indonesia or Brazil. Like even now, I have no doubts at all that it'll be. And for me, it was very easy to make that decision. I was like, look, I have never understood why is it easier to open up a center in Sholapur than to open up tech in Brazil. It's actually easier to open up online. If you're running an online education company, it's easier to open up a new market versus to set up a physical center in a tier 2 town in India. Right. And the world is very boundaryless. So I think that helped a lot.
Yeah, and we're already seeing some snippets of your belief of boundaryless world. Even in Singapore, as I browse through Facebook, I do see ads of Whitehead Junior.
Right.
So I have been watching that. But the question to you now, I'm slightly shifting gears to more of entrepreneur journey. Why startup in EdTech? What is the thought process there?
So you don't really start up in a category.
Why Whitehead Junior? That's the question.
Yes. See, at the time I was doing it like 18 months ago, EdTech was not hot by any means, right? So right now it's red hot right now. Everybody wants to be in EdTech, right? Because of COVID and all of that stuff. But when I started up, EdTech was not even considered to be a very profitable category overall, right? Because ARPUs were it was hard to make consumers pay for supplemental education and stuff. So you don't necessarily think of a category. I was very inspired by this idea, right? And it was again very personal, right? I read about early childhood coding. I read that kids who coded early, the biggest thing that happens to them is this very big psychological shift in their mind that everything in this world is an object created by someone and I can create things too, right? Because they very early, 6, 7, 8, they start to put things together. They start to create output out of it. So they start to get this feeling that, look, I can create anything. Everything in this world is a creation by someone, right? And I was very moved by that, right? Because I also thought that when I had my own kids, I always wanted them to be thinking of life like a playground of experimentation and creation, and not like a binary series of successes and failures, right? So I really like this idea of coding for kids, making them creators. And that led to the idea, let's do coding, but it was about creation, right? So the reason the course did very well, kids, we had such great word of mouth was because the kids were creating in every class, right? They were building stuff. And I think that as a result, the kids loved it. And that really led to the virality of the product, right? In every market, that's what happens, right? Kids love it. They tell other kids because it's all creation. So if all of EdTech was around the left brain, mathematics, getting into examination, IIT, we came and took a very different thought, right? We said that, look, kids are like, there is a great NASA study around kids' creativity peaks at age 5 and then kind of keeps reducing 50% year on year, like 50% every decade. And we'll be about kids' creative potential, right? And that's how we started. Kids loved it, parents saw value in it, and then it just did very well in every market we entered. Yeah. Sorry, you're on mute, Rahul.
Yeah, you already kind of touched upon it, but have you seen any difference between kids from Brazil versus kids from Indonesia?
See, pretty much they're the same, right? Kids are very much the same, right? Parents, they have a bit of a difference, right? But kids are pretty much the same. Kids love to build and create. We are doing the best building creation, gamified building creation ecosystem. So kids love it. Parents in developing markets are success oriented only. So all of our ads are really coder at age 8, billionaire at age 21, right? There is a lot of focus around output. You do code well and you'll be successful. Parents in the developed world, in US and UK, very focused on the kids' agency, that they enjoy something. Right, because the kid has to make the eventual choice. So our kind of communication in the US is a bit like input oriented, which is
you felt that Singapore is more result oriented because the
correct.
Ads,
so the ads, yeah, correct. No, we I mean, right now the algorithm judges for itself, but I guess the Singapore is also going into the results oriented territory.
Yeah. So talking about results, White Hat Junior has done fabulous. If you just look at results, Baidu came and bought it at 3 million. So what if that did not happen? What was the plan B? Or there was a plan already and Baidu kind of came and disrupted the plan. Maybe that's the more accurate story.
Kind of. See, at this stage, you don't sell a company in 18 months for a few $100 million, right? So obviously we were going down the funding route. So I was picking up a Series B funding of $50 million. Like, business was doing very well. So there was just tremendous interest, right? So to be fair, I mean, I would say I picked up Series A, like the company started in November, right? I technically left my job in Discovery only March 2019. So it's a very young company, barely 18 months old, right? And I picked up seed funding off the gate. After that, I picked up Series A in September. So about 12 months into the company. And then after that, I just was picking up Series B 6 months in. And I met Baiju, like barely, to be honest, based on today, I met Baiju exactly 2 months ago or 2.5 months ago, right? So we met he came in. At that time, though, I would say we had tremendous funding interest, but then there was also a lot of interest from acquisitions, right? There was Baiju's, but then there was also the other Indian EdTech players who had kind of picked up funding, wanted to merge or acquire. So there was a lot of interest. And at that point, I kind of like figured out that this is very good for the company. Yeah.
So your motivation for doing the startup that you are in is totally different. I understand you want to give it your 100%, you want to give your all energy, and you're kind of removed from whatever the outcome came, whatever valuation it is sitting on now, and whatever percentage of that you got. But for our audience, we have this question about, let's say your company sold for 100 million, your company is valued at 100 million. How much of that actually does the founder get to see? So if you could throw some insight.
No, it's good. I've been very transparent about the numbers, right? So I'm a good guy to ask these numbers from. See, the thing is this, why the startup thing is so hard is, right? First is that you have to reach that optimum level of how much funding have you raised in order to create a great revenue generating business. Because each time you raise funding, you keep diluting, right? So my kind of like general thought with founders is that if they are able to show a revenue generating business with little funding, right? That's why the product quality excellent has to be excellent completely. We can talk a little bit about the startup thing, right? But in order to answer the money question in parallel, it all depends on how much have you diluted, how much have you raised, right? In my case, just to give you the full journey, the first I picked up $1.3 million on a $6 million valuation because I had nothing. I just had a PowerPoint presentation. I was also with Discovery that time, so I didn't have the best leverage to kind of so $6 million valuation was totally on my background, right? So if any of us from IIM with good career track records go to a VC and say I'm starting a company, their company would be valued at $5-6 million, right? Because that's just the nature of the idea, the person. So I diluted about like a good 25% then, right? So the initial investors had 25% of the company. I had 60%. My employees had a 15% ESOP pool. Then I picked up the next round of funding was, I was very clear that I would pick up $10 million, nothing less, right? Because I knew that for the next round of funding, I would pick it up at a high valuation. So I would need to show a very good business trajectory. So I wanted to pick up $10 million. And then I diluted quite a lot, actually. So I went down to 40% ownership in the company with the second round of funding. Then I sold, right? So for 300 million at 40%, I made $120 million, right? So that's the clear number. There's nothing you rounded. There is also like obviously a performance-based system, right? With the Beju's acquisition where there is upside for high performance. So that 120 million could obviously go well north, but that's all nature of the deal, right? But yeah, typically. So it's really, but it's pretty clean, right? Out of I owned 40% of the company and I made 120 million because it sold for 300 million.
Yeah, but what is a typical number like? Because you made a very good point that you had a solid revenue model with very little funding, so you were able to demonstrate that early on. Yes. And hence somebody had the confidence in you to value at whatever valuation they came up with. But what is, and you have read so many books, so what is your typical assessment? If a company is 100 million, an average company, how much of that the starting founder actually gets? This question is very often asked and never answered.
Yeah, so I can answer it now. So you're saying if you sell the company for 100 million, how much will you get?
Yes, that's the question.
So the answer is it's all linked to how you execute it, right? So the thing is, very simply, the startup journey has to be extreme patience in the beginning, extreme patience, which people like us who are very seasoned, right? And are used to, when you're the CEO of Discovery, right? You're meeting the prime minister of the country and you're meeting Bear Grylls and you're getting the prime minister, you're meeting Rajnikant, right? You're very high profile. Suddenly, when you're a startup founder and you have 7 people working in a small room, you have to be unbelievably prudent, right? Which is very hard for people to do when they come from backgrounds like ours, right? Because they want the media blitz and they want people to be talking about their startup. But I think I was unbelievably prudent for the first 7 days. I would ruthlessly manage everybody's salary, right? I would look at how much spending we were doing on office space, printers, etc. The moment the product hit gold though, right? We had a good net promoter score. I went crazy in consumer acquisition and spending and scaling because the renewal rates were high and the product had very good response, right? So I guess the right answer is that if you take the funding and use it very wisely in the beginning to create a good product and have a lot of it left to scale the business, right? And get good revenue, then this equation is very powerful for you. What I've seen with most people is that in order to get to $100 million, right, of a sale, that means you are basically doing roughly, call it about $40 million, right? To be on the safer side, $40 million of revenue, a run rate. Your revenue run rate is $40 million, right? At least that means that basically in the month of the sale, you must be making about $3 million a month, right? For example, in revenue. In order to hit $3 million of revenue, people spend too much money, right? Because in the beginning, they build too many big teams. So a lot of the funding goes into product building. Very little of it goes into consumer acquisition. And that ratio leads you to reach the like a $40-50 million revenue run rate very late, right after maybe 2 to 3 rounds of funding. So you are probably going to get diluted to, if I was 40, you're probably going to get diluted to 20 as a founder. And typically you would have 2 co-founders, right? Or 1 co-founder. So you'll be at 10%, right? So 10% of $100 million is what you'll get, right? And by the way, by the third round of funding, there is dilution clauses and stuff, right? So the investors who invested $20 million first will get their out, 100 minus 20 million, 80 million. Out of that 80 million, then you're down to 10%, right? So $8 million. So the recipe to make a lot of money, single founder, but that's hard. Then you have to work very hard, right? Single founder, basically off the gate, you're got to make double the equity, right? Second, raising little money and diluting less, right? Consequently diluting less. In some cases, like Beju, he's raised a lot of money but diluted less. That's an exception. I think he's awesome. He's just an amazing guy at fundraising and overall running a great business also. But in general, the more you raise funding, the more you'll dilute. So having said that, now that's the thing. Raising less funding is not as important, or dilution is not as important. Revenue is the most important point, right? Making yourself a revenue generating company early is the most important thing for a good financial exit for yourself.
Right.
And if you can raise it, if you can do that with less funding, that's great. But if you have to take more funding, that's also great. But you have to get revenue. Without revenue, the market will not value you.
Right. So
I remember that there was another company being discussed during the time. See, my entire deal closed in 5 weeks because we were a revenue generating company by far, right? Other companies that were under acquisition mode can take 6 months, 1 year, because people are debating whether the company will add value, not add value, or how will it add value. Revenue generating companies are get sold very easily.
Right. So the mantra is, if you can start single, which is difficult. And if you can, try not to take as much money, try not to take a lot of money and be revenue positive, which is also difficult.
I would say very difficult, but I would say taking less money is also not that important, right? The biggest thing is basically become revenue generating quickly.
As soon as you can.
Focus on revenue generation very quickly, right? Don't focus on, because there's a lot of Paul Graham kind of advice on build a product that many users will like and revenue will follow. But I haven't seen that actually. I think I've seen too many people focusing on that, right? Create a product that people will pay for quickly, I think is a better mantra.
Right. And would that be your advice to entrepreneurs or something more to add?
No, I would say that would be my advice, right? I would say don't build a product that is, so Paul Graham's advice is that build a product that many users, so Facebook kind of mantra, right? Which is basically
build it and they will come.
Build it. No, I think he also says acquire, build it, acquire them. But his point is don't focus on revenue, right? His point is that basically focus on getting a lot of users to your product, and eventually you'll figure out the monetization strategy like Facebook did. Facebook didn't have a monetization strategy. The ad network came 4 years into the journey of being Facebook, right?
Right.
For me, that's a big crapshoot. Like it's a real big, you have to be funded for 3-4 years without showing revenue. Every time you go to a VC and you don't have a revenue model, the first question they'll be, what is your monetization plan?
Right.
It's very hard to value companies without revenue because there's no multiple that you can ascribe to them. In my case, I just went with the revenue first model, right? I created a product and I started charging for it very quickly.
Sure. So
we hit our first crore in revenue barely 3 months. Yeah.
So I'm shifting gears slightly, going a bit personal. You did talk about your wife, and they say behind success of every man, it's a cliche, but that's what they say. Behind every successful man, there is a woman. So what role did she play? And then there is a follow-up on that as well, which says that now, assuming that there was a woman behind your success, what are you doing to help women, both as trainers or as young kids trying to learn coding?
The latter is very good, right? In a way that is, the whole model was built around underleveraged women. That was the core starting point of the whole company. There was coding for kids that existed before us, right? We did the first live one-on-one coding. We were able to do live one-on-one coding at this scale, at this price point, because we went after a supply pool which was underleveraged. Women who were at home or underemployed in their jobs, fresh out of their jobs, they were doing QA jobs that they weren't fully interested in, for example. Right, we were able to leverage all of these women and give them a chance to work from home, teach kids from all over the world, and make so now our women on the actually by the 3rd month they make more than an IIM graduate, right? After who's, if she spends 50 to 60 hours on the platform in a month, in a week rather, she'll make more than an IIM graduate because she has kids from all over the world. The GDP per capita in high income markets is higher, so she's able to make more money than an IIM graduate, right? So it's the best gift, I think, for us that we have these underleveraged, highly qualified, intelligent women, and the company feels very, very strongly about them, right? So there's a lot of compassion built into the company on that side. As hard as we are running very big operations and sales, we are actually very compassionate to the teaching, to the women who teach, right? That's why the loyalty on the platform is so strong. Attrition rates are very low, right? So so I think that's great, right? Because we've as of now, there are 7,000 teachers and we are adding about 250 teachers a day right now. So like every month, like I think there are about 7,000 women. As a result, 7,000 families, right, who are getting empowered because of that. So I love that part about the nature of the business model itself, right? It's not that we are trying to do good. That's the business model. On the former, I would say your partner is the biggest decision you can make right in your life. Although I think it's an obvious fact, right? It's the single biggest decision you'll make right. I think
After
it's
going
got
to
everything to do. Huh?
The most important
Yeah, I
is
would
to go to the
say-
IIM.
Right. Correct, right. Maybe after that decision, right? Because see, the partner will shape everything, right? Either the partner, for me, my partner has really understood this very restless kind of a life, which will never be shaped by, like, she's an American, her parents are always, for now they won't probably, but for a long time they've been questioning, they would always be questioning that why, why with all this, why even with all the successful things do I keep self-destructing so often, right? But with her, she understands me fully, right? So for if her parents are looking at it and saying that, look, isn't he the CEO of Discovery? Why is he doing this 20-year-old tech startup kind of thing now? And why did he leave his job to write a novel, right? It's very hard to understand. It seems very self-destructive from the outside. But in my life, there's a pattern, right? I just get interested in things. I do them with full honesty, and hopefully, the results do come. And I think she understands it very deeply, right? So she's been very with her. I've never had to. I didn't have to explain my eccentricities, right? It's just I think that's I would say the only I think it's a big blessing not to be able to explain your very eccentric moves to your partner and just be able to liberate.
I feel that is another expression of your boundaryless world. You have found a partner in somebody who is not from the same background as you. And
Right.
related to that, my question is, you have lived across 3 continents. Your wife is not Indian. Where is home?
Home is nothing here. I mean, the thing is, we are. See, the thing is, part of my life is to be never buy anything, right? So I've never bought a house in my whole life, right?
Wow.
So it's been very important to my life policy that look, don't buy a house, rent a car as much as you can, right? Unless it becomes economically inefficient, right? Then but buy it with the intent of selling it, right? Not with the intent of keeping it, right? So I don't own anything, right? So for example, immediately after the startup got sold, right? Just a month ago, right? My landlady decided to sell our house, right? Which was a wonderful house in front of the beach in Bombay. And I mean, I had money, but I didn't even want to. I chose to not buy the house, and I just packed up my backpack and I moved to a hotel, and then I moved to Goa, right? So right now I'm doing this call from Goa right now.
Oh, wow.
And then my wife and kids are with the family in the US because they went for summer vacation, and they're moving to Goa. Now it's very good, right? My kids also live out of a backpack. My wife does, I do. So in a way, we are very liberated in that way. So I think it's very powerful. So I think the act of not buying anything, which is very sacred to our family, and the fact that our 5-year-old, 3-year-olds can live out of a backpack has made life very, I would say, kind of profoundly experimentative and fun, right? So we were very happy in the house. Don't get me wrong, right? I would have lived in Bombay, but since the landlady sold it, I was like, okay, why live in an apartment in Bombay right now when everybody's working remotely anyway? So
Right.
yeah.
So you did talk about you were very happy in house, and that brings me to my last but one question. So what does happiness mean to you now?
I think nothing has changed. I mean, I'll be honest in saying that I do feel a sense of relief, like the financial upside, which was unexpected and is very significant, is a sense of relief, right? I know I'm going to use barely a fraction of it, right, based on my kind of lifestyle. But on the other hand, I think it just makes me more creatively liberated, right? Earlier, I was doing all these things and hoping for the best. Now, at least I don't have to be worry about that. So I think that's good. But in general, I was very happy before just doing my work. I'm very happy now just doing my work. So nothing has changed at all in that way.
So nothing has changed even.
No, not at all. Because, I mean, yeah. No, I just enjoy going very deep into things. And right now I'm in the middle of this journey of going very deep into how to build a great startup, right? And I'm halfway into that journey. So I'm going to finish it. And so not even one thing changed the next day. Yeah.
And my last question is a customary question. What advice do you have for us?
No, I think we've talked a lot about. I mean, there's no particular advice because there's no one path, right? See, the thing is that people so if I look at Warren Buffett, right? I mean, very different path, right? He's just taken one vertical, gone completely deep, and made it his life. I mean, like most successful people have done that, right? Now, there is another path, right, which is mine, which is also, I would say, I mean, it's not those very fabulous success, but it's reasonable success, which is basically keep meandering, do things that you're interested in, do them very deeply, and then kind of move on and do something else altogether, and that's fine, right? That's so my point is that it's very hard to like I think if anything, I would say my advice is that there is no formula here, right? I'm probably the least likely, if somebody had done a survey and I am maybe 20 years ago, least likely to have, maybe not. I mean, I was good at certain things, but I would not have ranked in the list of people who would have kind of probably done it, because I was kind of meandering then also, right? So, but I figured out a wanderer's path to, enlightenment of a kind. So I'm just doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess your takeaway is there is no path. Follow whatever you feel like is the path.
Follow whatever you feel like. I mean, you know it, right? You know it instinctually, right? And yeah, so I think the moment you feel that a job has run its course, I mean, it's totally fine to leave it and do yoga for a year, is my point, right? The point is that if you're just my general thought is that if you're not choosing dramatic growth, right, you're not going to get dramatic output, right? The dramatic output will follow dramatic growth, very significant growth, right? So if somehow, I think people have taken the very wrong interpretation that safety somehow means, I think it's very unsafe in some ways, if that's what people want, right? On holding onto your job as a director of a company, right? And keep doing the same thing. When you have people like us, right, who are doing who are trying to kind of like explode their mind with growth opportunities, right? I mean, somebody like me who's a CEO, who's left his CEO job to learn how to build a database structure and APIs and tech inside out and build a company. Hey, by the way, if I'm suppose the startup hadn't worked and if I was the CEO again, I would be the best CEO in the industry, right? Because I just know tech inside out. I know how to implement tech. Right. So I think in some ways, my only advice would be to seek very dramatic growth in every day, in every moment, and the moment it stabilizes, to quit.
I think that's a very,
if any job stabilizes. Yeah, and it's fine, dramatic, right? Just quit and then dramatic growth, right? I mean, and that could be in any vector. What I've learned, if anything, is that if it could be in any vector, it could be to learn how to discipline your body and mind to become a yoga teacher, right, for a year. But that's also dramatic growth in a vector. It shapes your personality. And I think the world eventually always rewards dramatic growth, and it doesn't reward evolutionary. It rewards revolutionary growth, right? So I would say revolutionary growth, selection of revolutionary growth would be insurance to all ups and downs. Yeah.
So if I were to sum it up, it's dramatic growth, reach up to the level that you wanted to, then quit it all, start all over again. That's what you're trying to say.
It kind of happens, right? See, what happens is that's almost a natural consequence. Quitting is not how I start, but I reach a point, because I'm so obsessed with the growth of it, right, that I'll reach a point where I'll feel that, look, any more change things that I'm doing in this startup are going to be incremental.
And marginal utility is not.
There's no point in incrementality, right? So just abandon that construct and go to something again where you are seeking dramatic growth, and then as a result, you shape up very significantly as a human, right? You are very kind of like just like a person who just grows dramatically, right? And as a result, your output will reflect. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karan, for this session. The first time I connected with you, I had no idea that you are an entrepreneur. I connected you in the capacity that, hey, I have a book, I want to get this published in India. How can I get this done? I had never imagined that a few weeks later, I would be asking you to come and have a session with our alumni here. But it has been a lovely session and a lot of insights, definitely for me. And I'm very sure also for our audience.
Real pleasure.
It's really nice to speak to you. Over to you, Sneha.
Thanks, Karan, for the wonderful session. I'm sure all of us have gathered insights from your journey to a millionaire. So we'll be taking a Zoom selfie with all the participants.